does this lead to the buildup of social complexity in a historically specific, non-arbitrary fashion? To put it negatively, most out of the myriad of possible communications do not lead to a continuation of communication. And social, that is communicatively constituted, structures condition which communication leads to further communication, or at least the chances of this taking place. Take, as a very general but fairly easy example, the difference between a stratified and a modern, functionally differentiated society. In a stratified society, everything, all communication, depended on which stratum people belonged to, nobility, clergy, or peasantry. As a rule that only decayed in a long historical process and through a number of revolutions, it was simply not possible for the peasant to utter scientific truth claims based on a code of true-false, or claims on political power against the nobleman. Truth, right, power, and so on were usually on the side of but one stratum of society, and this conditioned what could be communicated, how communication could continue. Not so in modern, functionally differentiated society, in which the function systems of society are operatively autonomous. Communication in the economic system continues on the basis of the code of monetary value. In the scientific system, on the basis of the code of true-false. In the legal system, on the basis of the code of legal and illegal. This is what in earlier Poissonian sociology was called symbolically generalized media of communication. Something is not legal because someone has a lot of money, and having a lot of money does not result in privileged truth claims, and so on. Not where one sits in society conditions the continuation of communication, but how social, operatively autonomous, and closed social systems communicate and observe themselves and their environments. Change in this context takes the form of social evolution. Now, underline the social in this. Social evolution here simply means that the social world proceeds through a never-ending flow of variation, selection, and restabilization of meaning through communication. This is, mind you, not to say that there is any directionality in history, but social evolution is not arbitrary either. Which variation gets selected is conditioned by existing social structure. If under the condition of functional differentiation, for example, in the scientific system, the variation is proposed nowadays, academic papers should be published because the authors are rather wealthy, this variation will very likely not be selected, whereas if the variation is of more professional standards within the scientific systems, they might very well be. And just for the sake of completeness, this has nothing to do with natural evolution whatsoever. Social or socio-cultural evolution does not remain limited to the transfer of information adaptation, but involves learning and meaning, both unavailable on the level of genes. Of course, one could now argue that although such a perspective might be a sophisticated one, a counterintuitive one quite different from many others in the social sciences, it might still, when it comes to the difference between the classical and the quantum worldview, be still pretty much on the classical side of things, even if rather complex. Yet I think there are a number of hints that suggest it might be otherwise. And I would like to argue that the central hint here comes from the role of observation and its role in transferring virtuality into actuality. Put into general and quite abstract terms, the argument would run as follows, and it is a very preliminary one, admittedly. World society, as the most encompassing social system conceivable, exhibits quantum properties. It contains all possible forms of meaning, except those processed within psychic systems. It contains all possible forms of meaning in a state of superposition. This state of superposition describes a universe of what could be called lines of flight, which describe the virtuality of all meaning, the possible horizons of meaning in the classical Husserlian phenomenological sense. The actualization of meaning completely depends on operations of observation. However, not everything can be observed in any arbitrary way at any time. There are historically specific limits of observation, and these hang together with modes of observation that are contingent on forms of social differentiation, contingent on specific, symbolically generalized media of communication, and contingent on specific systemic programs. Let me elaborate on this briefly. The distinction between virtuality and actuality might sound trivial, but it isn't. It is not the same as the difference between possibility and reality that arguably characterizes classical social scientific thought. The standard model here consists of a universe of possibilities out of which causalities produce realities. But there are alternatives to the standard model, and the line of thought I'm harking back to is one that can be traced back most specifically to a line of thought that I think probably emerged with the German philosopher Leibniz, that has probably found its most complex contemporary articulation for the purposes we are here talking about in the works of French philosopher Gilles Deleuze. And that, I would actually argue, constitutes some quantum thinking in nucleo in philosophy and the social sciences, long before anybody dared to think of quantum theory in the natural sciences. And incidentally, it is quite telling that Alexander Wendt, in his account of quantum minds, also needs to go back to Leibniz. And I quote Alex Wendt here briefly: "Individuals as Leibnizian monads mirror the social whole within their minds and reflect it back in their practices." So monads that are all the same. This pretty much goes back to what Massimiliano earlier this morning was talking about when he said, well, there is indistinguishability, this indistinguishable, but still there is individuality. However, unlike Leibniz, whose monads were quanta without windows, and whose perception of and entanglement with the world had therefore to be ensured by God, Alex Wendt's quantum minds, lacking divine backup, have windows that allow them to perceive and be entangled with the world. Now, simply building in a window into a philosophical concept is an elegant solution, but I think it is too simple. And I think there have been other solutions. And this is actually the point where Deleuze offers a solution that keeps the monads, the quanta without windows, by replacing the windows as holes in them that would, in a sense, disturb the integrity of monads by the Baroque figure of the fold. I don't want to go into too much philosophical detail here, but the figure of the fold allows Deleuze to do two things. On the one hand, it retains an absolute distinction between an inside and an outside. There is no direct link between the monad and the world. But, I quote Deleuze, "The enclosure is the condition of being for the world. The condition of enclosure counts as the infinite opening of the finite. It represents infinity in a finite way. It gives the possibility to the world to start anew in every monad. The world needs to be put into the subject for the subject to be in the world. It is this turning that constitutes the fold of the world and the mind." And mind you, I think you could actually insert, whenever I say monad, the term concept as used by Massimiliano earlier this morning, although I think in the end we're not talking about concepts only. This is a distinction between an inside and an outside of monads that preserves, in minds, that preserves the absolute character of this distinction, yet links it with the world. I would argue that the central feature of this link, and I think this is the groundbreaking basic motive that this way of thought shares with quantum theory, is observation. This is how monads, Wendt's quantum minds, and the world become entangled. And this is how virtuality is transposed to actuality. And this is maybe also the central point how micro and macro become linked. Let me quote Niklas Luhmann on this. communication is only possible as an observing operation. Observations are quite real events, that is, operations. The reality value does not lie in the reality of their objects that can be observed and described, but solely in the reality of the operation of observation itself, that is, in testing of a resistance that does not reside in an objective external world, but solely in the recursive networking of the system's operations themselves. Quote end. Now, I do confess that I cannot do full justice to developing this line of thought here extensively, and that there is a lot of very, what I would call, hyper-disciplinary work between philosophy, sociology, and other sciences that needs to be done. But I think it provides a promising basis for a quantum view on world society, or maybe better, for bringing world society and quantum views together. A view of the social world that is characterized by entanglements, and entanglements not in a purely metaphorical sense, but in the stronger sense that see entanglements as observations, and thus as the very basic fabric that ties society together. There is an ocean, a myriad of possible communications. Communication defines a virtuality. The interesting part for basic social science is the transformation of virtuality into actuality. This often happens by chance. It is this operation of observation that takes place and not another one. But in world society, there is not complete arbitrariness. The question of what communication is and how it can be successful in the sense of leading to further communication is always to a large degree conditioned by forms of social differentiation that are expressed in specific historical semantics and concepts. Now, this provides a vista to a view of entanglement of and in world society that is not simply a story of networking and the question of global expansion of networks. And it is also a way around the micro-macro issue that has plagued the social sciences forever. Entanglement does not respect spatial distance. Spatial distance is a strong and historically and culturally often valid, but not a necessary condition for the production of meaning. To conclude, is this real? Is this just metaphorical quantum social science? Well, what it is, I would argue, is an argument that world society theory, expressed through modern systems theory, the theory of social differentiation, and the theory of social evolution, that has been somewhat of an outlier in mainstream social science for long, on the one hand, and quantum theory, that has been somewhat of an outlier in mainstream social science for a long time, that both provide valid theoretical descriptions of the world. And it is an argument that using some translating devices here can be a fruitful way in order to facilitate an exchange in this respect. There's much work to be done, and I'm happy that events like this are a start of this work being done. But what I wish to emphasize by way of conclusion is that for all the novelty of thinking involved in quantum thought, maybe this is less a start from scratch as sometimes thought of. There are, and for longer have been, very different ways of looking at the world, not only in the natural sciences, but also in the social sciences and humanities, that might bear a family resemblance to quantum thought. And actually, one of the most promising ways forward might be to take a step back, actually, and devote a little more time to the origins and developments of these resemblances in order to have better dialogue with them in the future. Thanks a lot.
So we have plenty of time for discussion. Other questions? Yes, please.
Sure. One of the problems I have is your seems to put a lot on meaning, the value of meaning, observation to make meaning. I might suggest instead that prediction leading to an observation might be better. If you're thinking about meaning, it's often said from the pioneers of quantum mechanics that one of the first things to be lost is an understanding. Feynman was, I'm paraphrasing badly, but Feynman often said, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you should think again, something like that. Many have said that if you have an intuition, you should leave it at the door. Don't bring intuition with you. So, and we often can see in politics one piece of observation being interpreted by the liberals and the conservatives oppositely. Even though they might agree on what the observation is, their interpretation, their meaning that follows conflicts with the two interpretations. So maybe you could respond to that.
Well, thanks a lot. I think what is absolutely crucial to understanding this line of reasoning I was putting forward is the idea that it's not about understanding. It's not about particular kinds of meaning. It's also not about interpretations. It's the claim that, first of all, that meaning is a medium by which social and psychic systems distinguish themselves from their environment. This is what sets physical systems, biological systems, what do you have in the world apart from psychic systems and social systems? Social systems and psychic systems operate by processing meaning. In whatever way they do this, but this is what really sets them apart from their environments that are not psychic and social systems, and actually also leads, I was briefly hinting at that, to what I think is the fundamental difference between natural and social evolution, as the processing of information and adaptation is something that can happen everywhere in the natural world, whereas social cultural evolution actually in addition proceeds through processing meaning and what is commonly known as learning. That is something that does simply not happen in the natural world. So basically, this is the notion of meaning I was using, and the idea again, and this very much goes back to what I said. This is so extremely counterintuitive. It's so far away from everyday understandings. When I talk about observation, I do not mean people. I do not mean myself or you observing something in the commonsensical use of the term. I mean observation as the basic form of the operation of a social system, either as a self-observation or observation of its environment, a system in its environment, thereby always constantly reproducing and reconstituting itself as a system through a distinction between a system and an environment. This then leading to this rather strange, counterintuitive view that social systems constitute a society that is actually not made up of people. It's the systems that observe. The systems communicate through other references. Individuals are addresses of communication. They are addressed in communication all the time. But there is, of course, a very sharp distinction. There is a very sharp distinction between social systems that operate on the basis of meaning, and psychic systems, which might be called consciousnesses, which is basically what goes on in here. And both are not somehow wired into each other. They can only observe each other as environment of each other.
Yeah, so we have a question in the back.
So I find this very convincing, and I think from computer science point of view it's not so weird. I mean, thinking about events and trigger events. So my question is now that we have now this beautiful theory, how to validate this. So is there any validation, some kind of data? So how would you now validate it? Or has it been already validated from data?
No, it's not a theory which you would validate. It's first of all a proposal of a few. It's a proposal of a few. of the social world, which actually has the great advantage of accounting for the social world and actually accounting for change in the social world without relying on any kind of strong ontological assumptions. I think the interesting point I was actually trying to make, and this is next to the leaving beside the more general argument about how do you validate a large theory in the social sciences or in philosophy. But I think one of the big points I've tried to make is that this theory, or this way of looking at things, this way of theorizing things, seems to have a lot of possible links to the quantum view of the world. And that is, and this is the very interesting thing, and that is although it has emerged from traditions of thought that, as far as I know, have never been in anything resembling close contact with quantum theory, not at all. Which is why, in the end, I was also making this argument. But of course, more research would need to go into this, and more historians of ideas need to be called for. What I think is that actually you find in some traits and traditions of thoughts in philosophy and maybe in the social sciences, you find some kind also of co-development, of co-evolution of thoughts that were expressed in the natural sciences only after the invention of quantum theory.
Why not applying it now? I mean, we have now, I think it's the only way to what kind of social theory should be applied to the world society? Mm-hmm. I think we cannot use an anthropological individualism, will not work. And so I think this kind of approach is the only way that I see currently that can be applied as a theory. So why not now as a next step? There's big data, there's a lot of data. So why not applying?
Let me give you two answers to this. One is a very straightforward one. The other one is a very political one. Yes, it's worth trying, but there is a lot of work to be done, and a lot of work needs to be put into that. Number two, then, it is a really political answer. The kind of analysis you're looking for, you will never get funded in the social sciences. You're talking about data and masses of data and processing of data that is way beyond the scope of any social science research funding program.
So we have a question here.
I know the theory of Luhmann more or less, and I also know quantum mechanics more or less, but in your talk I haven't clearly heard the overlap. So maybe let me try to formulate a different way. You spoke about the legal system, and the scientific system, and the economic system, which each have their own communications that make use of the same communication channels, that make use of the same psychic systems, but are still separate. Each poietic systems with their own closures. So one way to see this would be an analogy with quantum mechanics with waves and particles, or between position and momentum. That's to say, incommensurable properties that make use of the same substance somehow, but the moment you see the one, you don't see the other one, and vice versa. Would that be a good analogy?
I think so, yeah. That would work. Straightforward. That would work. Very straightforward. I think one could elaborate on this. But as you, what I also want to re-emphasize is what you basically said, is that, and this goes back to something I mentioned just a few minutes ago. We are basically looking at two bodies of thought and theory that come out from completely different traditions and have not had much in common thus far. And this is what fascinates me, that actually once you think through some of theoretical properties, you find things that sound somehow similar, and links can be established. And I would actually claim that out of the well, many large-scale social theories around, and there aren't that many, this is probably the one that opens itself up easiest also to quantum thought.
I tend to agree with you, but I haven't heard you say clearly what are the similarities between Riemannian theory and quantum mechanics.
Well, the idea is basically that meaning is produced through observation only, and there is basically no meaning in the world. There are no fixed ontologies in the world. The social world, and it's only about the social world and society, is not something that exists governed by classical forces as like people, individuals, atoms interacting with each other, but sense and meaning is only produced through and in the moment you observe them. This, I think, is the starting point.
I think there are quite a lot of other theories in philosophy and psychology that make similar points. But then there's just another similarity. The social system in terms of Riemann is distributed, it's not localized. It's not in the head of one particular thing. The legal system is not in the court, it's not in the head of the judge.
Mm-hmm.
It's everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another kind of form of non-locality, you might say.
Well, the non-locality in the sense that that the system does not depend on spatial presence, and with a very few exceptions, it does also not depend on presence at all. I mean, the exception, of course, being simple interaction systems, like the interaction system we are having here. I mean, this interaction system requires presence, even if it's remote presence. And this system, unlike a big function system, like the legal system, this interaction system here will cease to exist once we walk out of this room. And so there are many interaction systems that require presence that will not even be remembered in further social communication. I mean, this conference will, but a casual observation between two people on the street might not be. And you're absolutely right. This is one of the intriguing similarities, that this presence is not required, and this is, I think, is the real novelty also in the social sciences, that you can and must not say people or organizations are part of this or that system. I mean, even a court is an important address in the legal system, but it's not part of the legal system. If a court decides to buy new furniture, this is economic communication. If it hires people, if it does stuff like that. So it's not part of the legal system. The function systems of society operate as operatively closed communicative systems and are thus actually completely dependent on self and other observation, but they are removed from what I would actually call the society we would traditionally think about what society is, namely the society of people and maybe institutions or organizations interacting.
So we certainly have time for one more question.
Yeah, thank you for your exposition. I really like the traditional lecture style. That was nice. My question is, could you flesh out philosophically your central category of communication a bit more? So the kind of question I have is, well, okay, but what about the role of persons, of individuals? Are they the mere bearers, the mere processing units in communication that's going on? Or if you stress the importance of communication is continuing, does that lead to some kind of process ontology? Or are there certain units of meaning in the sense of memes that are being carried around? So that's the kind of question that would have to flesh out this central category a bit more.
I'm trying to be very brief because that would be a very long answer. The biggest problem for social theory, or let me put it, a theory of society, I have to reiterate, is how does communication continue, and which communication does continue? Because after all, it's a problem of unlikelihood. Why should one communication lead to the next one. And certainly a lot of communication, in a sense, leads to nowhere. It's simply forgotten, in a sense. And how comes such unlikely things happen that people actually know instantly what money is about in society, what political power is about in society. Know in the sense of it makes sense and you can continue on this basis. And I think a central historically evolved feature that makes this possible is the evolution of already described in Parsons of so-called symbolically generalized media of communication. You simply know communication continues. For example, in the economic system, one monetary value transfer refers to the next one court ruling of legal and illegal refers to another one, and so on, and so on, and so on. It operates on the basis of distinct codes that in modern society are functionally specific codes, so the code of legal and illegal. But I think the most crucial point is that it is communication that communicates. It is not the individuals, not people. There is no direct link between what a psychic system might come up with that then leads to some kind of utterance in writing or orally, and what the social system makes of this. This is, I think, the most crucial point.
Are there any other questions? Okay, so in that case, we thank Mathias so much for introducing us.
Thank you.